Thank you for coming out on a Saturday afternoon, on a beautiful Saturday afternoon. Marjorie Tenner, my next door neighbor for many years, for 20 years. So nice to see you, Marjorie. And I'm sure there are others here I know as well. I am thrilled to be here. Lisa is here because of Dave, and then I think realized that I have a connection to this place as well. I'm going to quickly tell you that my connection to Lisa Belkin is pretty intense and was life-changing for me, although she did not know it. A number of years ago, when she was doing the Mother Load column at the New York Times, she had a column on the convict women who transformed Australia, who were sent on ships, on repurposed slaving ships to Australia when that continent was colonized by Britain and was 9-to-1 men to women, and so they sent over these women, and it was essentially a breeding program. And you highlighted that in a column, which was quite unusual because her column was usually contemporary issues, but I read it all the time because I had contemporary issues with my 3 boys and loved the whole thing. But it really catapulted me. I had some sort of swirling ideas, and they all coalesced when I read that piece in the New York Times. And so I have been talking about Lisa for years before I met her, and in fact I have a slideshow that I do about the exiles, and you are, as you know, in my slideshow. And so when I met her, I felt like I was meeting a rock star. And we became fast friends. I don't remember how we met.
You were at a party, and I got a call from a friend who went to KJ, who went to the party, who said, I just spent, a half an hour listening to Christina Baker Kline tell me about how you inspired her latest book, or one of her books. And I fangirled on Christina because I am a fan of yours. And so we had this wonderful, some phone conversations, you just click. So we talked by phone and then met in person, and we've gone from there. And then I made her come all the way out to Montclair,
which I was thrilled to do,
and do this. So thank you.
Thank you. Lisa's book is wonderful. I hope you've had a chance to read it, and if you haven't, I hope that this conversation will inspire you to pick it up. She is a real investigative journalist, and what you get in this book is history, real murder exploration and story, and literary nonfiction. So it's this incredible combination. Where are my glasses? I have a lot of questions. So I'm going to ask questions of Lisa, and we're going to have a conversation for about 30 minutes, and then I'm going to open it up. We're going to open it up for you to ask whatever you like. So should we start?
We shall start. One of my favorite things is conversation with Christina.
So Lisa, maybe where we should start is with just telling in a sentence or 2 or 3 or 5 what the book is about.
A sentence or 2, it took 9 years.
We're going to get to that.
I cut 70,000 words from the first draft.
And it's a big book.
It's a big book.
How many words is it now?
It's about 125,000 now.
Yeah.
And
the average book is about 80 to 100,000.
Yeah, 70,000 is a book. I cut a book out of my book, and it was necessary in order to sort of figure out where the story was. And that was an interesting writing exercise. But in a few words, it is a story about 3 families, 4 generations of 3 families whose lives collide one night with a murder of a police officer in Stamford, Connecticut. And it's my deep dive back in time to the origins of these 3 men and looking over the generations that shaped them, and how does one become the cop, one become the killer, and one become my stepfather, who inadvertently set this shooting into motion. And it started with a story.
So you have done this before.
I have done that little thread before for many editors and publishers, yes. But so that was the kernel of it, and it started with a story that he told me, and it ended with me realizing that all of history arguably creates any given event. In this one, I became that crazy person with the murder board, the arm that goes.
When you walk into the room,
Yes,
and,
yes.
oh, what's going
I
on?
might have gone a little bit overboard, but was just stunned to realize that in fact I could draw a direct line between the crimes of Leopold and Loeb in 1924 and the death of David Troy in 1960, or
David Troy is one of
is
the...
I do refer to him as my officer, my police officer in this book. It starts with a train crash in 1906 because you could argue, I do, that had that train not crashed in 1906, David Troy might not well have died in 1960. And it's true of all of us. I mean, we're all fascinated by the sliding doors, butterfly effect,
Yeah.
but you don't always spend 10 years obsessively researching it.
Right.
This is the result when you do.
I just realized I took out, I had in my notes a paragraph. I thought, I'm not going to read a paragraph that you wrote, but actually I would have just read it. Because part of what is so satisfying about reading this book is that you're reading beautiful writing about a sort of philosophical idea of how events happen and the sort of, as you said, the chain link that leads from 1906 to the present day of your story, which is, I think, Independence Weekend 1960 is when this murder happens, and then forward to your stepfather happening to mention it to you. Let's go back a little bit to, let's start at the origin of your story. Tell us what it was that led you to that moment in time.
So, where I first heard this story, you mean?
No, to the 1906.
Oh, to
We'll
the
come back to
1906
that.
train crash.
To the 1906.
I mean, really go back.
Yeah, I want to
love when people
start.
really want to go back.
I want to
Yes.
start where you do with
Always. That's a question. I mean, for years as a reporter, that was almost always my first question. Take me back to the beginning, and it was always fascinating to hear what people's versions of the beginning was. And I heard this story from Al, basically about what happened in 1960. Al was my stepfather, and what his involvement with this prisoner was, and how his actions led to this prisoner acting in a way that led to the murder of a police officer. But Al's story was 1960.
Let me just ask you quickly, when did your stepfather tell you this story and why?
It was 2014, and he and my mother had been fairly recently married. I call him my stepfather. Legally, that's what he was, but it's odd meeting a man who's your stepfather when you're in your 50s and he's in your 80s. We didn't know each other very well. It's not like this man helped raise me. And as part of getting to know each other, they moved to Tucson, he and my mom, and I went to visit. It was one of my first visits to them in his new house. And as part of getting to know him, he read Show Me a Hero, one of my previous books. And it had just been greenlit, actually, by HBO for the miniseries. So he read the book, and he sat down at breakfast, and he speaks slowly and deliberately. He does everything slowly and deliberately. And he said, "Your book reminds me of a story." And he proceeded to spend 45 minutes telling me what is essentially the last third of the book, which was his direct participation in all the events. And I was struck from that telling by the fact that he was talking about 3 young men who they arguably started at the same starting line. They were all brought here by families who, for the same reasons we're still arguing about now, right? To give these kids a better life. And yet one led a life that led him to become an enforcer of the law, another to become a violator of the law. And then there was Al, who, in trying to do the right thing, that was his goal here, was to help this man get rehabilitated and start a new life. In trying to do the right thing, ended up doing something that went terribly, terribly wrong. So how did these 3 men at the same starting line end up so very different. And I went back to what Al couldn't know. Right? All of them were shaped by forces that they knew nothing about. And so that's how I ended up in 1906.
I want to go back to 1906, but before that, I want to know when he spoke to you then and told you this story, did you have an aha moment, or was it something that percolated for you?
Now, I looked at him and I said, you know I have to write about this, don't you? And he sort of took a deep breath and said, well, if you must.
He was probably pretty excited about it.
I am not sure, I have never been sure whether this was the goal, right? Whether this was, in a way, an unburdening. Because what Al did led to someone's death. I know that affected the rest of his life. I know that he went on to study in a very rigorous way the social determinants of health, the non-medical factors that affect a person's mental and physical health. And he said it was because of this experience. Here was this man who in so many ways was like him. They were both brilliant, they were both autodidacts. They sat in this lab that they shared. Al was running it, Joe was training in it in the Stateville Penitentiary, and they sat in this lab and they talked about art and culture and literature and science and what they were reading and what they had read, and they were alike for the moments that they were in this space. And then when one went back to his cell and the other one went home to his wife and increasing number of children. And so Al spent a lifetime trying to figure out how someone so like him could also be so different. So I know it changed his life, and I think there was an unburdening of sorts in the telling of the story.
Did you interview him more? Did you go back and talk with him?
I interviewed him constantly for years, and
9 years.
And it was a very good way to get to know your new stepfather. Hi, tell me about your childhood. Tell me about your mother. I know far more about his family than I know about my own, which is a point of some contention sometimes in family events. But yes, I interviewed him constantly. The first thing I did was I fact-checked him, right? He told me this story. Well, was it true? He told it to me 60 years after it happened. He was in his 80s. So I went and I did the things you can do nowadays in your pajamas at home. And I looked up various archives and newspapers, and yes, in fact, there was a police officer killed, and his name was David Troy. He did not remember his name, but he certainly remembered the events. He was killed by a man named Joseph DeSalvo, who Al did remember his name, although he got the spelling slightly wrong, because Joe, in fact, used D-I or D-E for many years of his life. So everything that could check out did check out. I'm sort of getting to the epilogue here, but over the years, over those 9 years, his memory got less and less exact. And eventually I stopped asking, because I was asking him for stories of his life that he knew he should know, that he had known and had written me long, long letters about, and that he couldn't access. And so I stopped asking because it was just upsetting to everyone. And COVID did not treat him well. It is not good for memory and cognition to sit inside your house in Arizona and see only my mother. And he kept telling me to write faster because he wanted to read the book. He did read the book. He read certainly The Galleys, and he got the hardcover. He read it as though it happened to someone else, and which was.
What do you mean by that?
It wasn't his story. He didn't remember it. He was very impressed with this person, but he did not remember this story. And then the public,
Yeah, it got to
well, it was, and to now upset everyone in the room, and I'm sorry, but the pub date of the book was May 28th of this year, and that was Al's funeral. And so in a book about, you know, coincidence and the ebbing and flowing of and cross-hatching of, I mean, it was just, you can't make that. Fiction writers couldn't make that up and get away with it.
If you did, right, no one would like it.
And I mean, I thought of canceling a lot of that. I had things scheduled, there were events, there were parties. If Al hadn't told me that story, it would not exist, right? Because we are our stories, we are what we leave behind. And so I think, I thought of canceling, and then I thought, he gave me this story, he told me to tell it, so I did, so I am. And it's all part of that tale.
Well, yeah, it feels very meta.
Yeah, not in the Facebook sense, though. But yes, it does.
Right,
It truly does. It feels profound, that he handed it to me. That's the dedication. It says to Alvin R. Charloff, thank you for entrusting me with your memories. Not trusting, which he did, but entrusting. Here, Lisa, you take this, you keep it safe. And I feel like I did.
Yeah. So now I want to go back to the train. Okay, so why start there? Why not start in, you know, the 16th century, or maybe a farmer in the 18th century, or why with that moment?
There's a little 18th century because all of these people's ancestors went to the 18th century. Why 1906? Al knew that his grandfather had died when his father and most of his siblings were fairly young. And he knew that they had all gotten together after this death, and there were 10 of them. There were 10 siblings and his widowed mother, and they all got together, as immigrant families often did in those days, and said, okay, one of you is going to college, one of you is going to fulfill your father's dream, and in fact it was this particular father's dream, that you go and get an education, and it's going to be baby Isidore. For many reasons, probably because that gave them the longest amount of time to save all the money, because baby Isidore was only a year old. And so they all went off and they got work, and they came home with their salaries, and they put some of it into a kitty for the actual tuition for Isidore's eventual college education. And Isidore, in fact, was a brilliant man who grew up to be a renowned neurosurgeon. There's something called the Charloff cyst, which some of you may have come across in life, which was named after Isidore Charloff. And he became Al's mentor. And Al describes deciding to become a doctor because of his time spent with his great uncle Isidore. Well, I went to check up on what I could in the archives about this family back in the early 1900s. And I found the clips from this train crash. God bless local reporters. There were more of them, right? Because there were actually there were local newspapers in every single small entity in the country, and they were deeply interested in what was happening in that very small place, which meant Max Charloff's death was huge news. He was on a train. He was bringing horses back from the Badlands of South Dakota. That was what he did for a living. He basically broke horses so that they could pull carriages, and they were kind of the Avis of Norwalk, Connecticut. You needed a buggy and you didn't own one. You went and you rented a buggy from the Charloffs. So he was bringing a bunch of horses back on a train, and the train had to be rerouted because a hose had broken on another train that was completely unrelated to this one. So they rerouted a lot of trains around Altoona, Pennsylvania, and they screwed up, and 2 of them ended up on one line of track, and they collided. And the local reporter of the time described it as like 2 bucking stallions, you know. And It was the local news reports that told me about the hose outside Altoona, that told me that they had turned the train around so that Max Charloff was supposed to be in the last car, but now he was in the first car, and it was the first car that had most of the casualties. In other words, it was coincidence and happenstance and circumstance that led to this man's death and then led to everything else. So why does it start with a train crash in 1906? Because if a hose hadn't broken on a completely different train outside of Altoona, then these two trains might not have collided and Max would not have died. And if Max hadn't died, they wouldn't all gotten together and sent Isidore to college. He would be in the buggy business. But instead, they sent him to college and he became a renowned neurosurgeon, and he became a mentor to his nephew, Al, who ended up as a doctor being stationed running some prisoner malaria drug trials at the Stateville Penitentiary, meeting a man named Joseph DeSalvo, befriending him and helping him get parole. And on parole, things went terribly wrong and he crossed paths with David Troy. So, as I said, if the train hadn't crashed in 1906, David Troy might not have died in 1960. And that's why the book starts in 1906.
That's pretty good, right?
Even though my editor had questions about that.
So many questions.
And even though my son, who actually produces films for a living, kept saying, train crashes are very expensive. It had to start with a train crash in 1906. It just had to.
Okay, but what I'm thinking as you're telling this story is that it takes a lot of digging to get to that. So you have this moment with your stepfather where you have this eureka moment where you've got a story and you're going to tell the story, and you probably start thinking about a book and how this book will happen, and maybe you have an agent, or I don't know how it worked, you'll have to tell us. And so the book, it seems to me, having read the book long ago, when I wrote a blurb for you and then rereading it again.
Thank you, by the way. It was a really lovely blurb.
Thank you. I said it had all the velocity of historical fiction, which I know quite well, so it does, really does. But so as you are sort of working toward creating a book here, how in the world did you end up with all these bits and pieces, and when did they come into the process? And were you then working with an editor who was saying, that feels like it might be going down a rabbit hole, or this other whole aspect, which we'll talk about in a moment, maybe goes down a rabbit hole? How did you decide on the scope of this book?
I went back and I reread the proposal a while ago, and what was fascinating to me was what I didn't know when I proposed the book. And the proposal was after a year or so of research. I already knew it was a slightly larger story, but I didn't know about, and we'll get to them, I assume, Leopold and Loeb. I did not know that Leopold and Loeb play a direct role in this story. I did not yet know about the train crash. I knew there was one, but I hadn't found the most detailed clips yet. I had a lot of the family story of the generation of these three men and their parents, which is what I thought the story was, these immigrant parents and their children, and I had not gotten all the way back. The problem was, and I get a little woo-woo here, and I'm not a woo-woo person, but every time I sort of went to find out just a little bit more for a sentence or two, it was as if there were people sitting there in the archives waving at me and saying, well, it's about time you showed up. We know we're part of this story, and it's nice for you to have figured this out. So it was really all, I'm going to write about, his parents. Well, he did tell me about his grandfather. Let me just, let me Google that. And then I was in really deep, and then it took 9 years. And what did my editor think? I gave him the first 200 pages, and I walked into his office, and he said, okay, so Lisa, is this a book about immigration or Leopold and Loeb or parole and he lists 5 other things? And I said, yes. And he looked at me for a long time and he said, and maybe I shouldn't quote this because it's a little self-serving or whatever, but he looked at me and said, this is either going to be utterly brilliant or fatally flawed. And you're not going to know until you're done, so just keep writing. And that's what I did for the next bunch of years, with no more money from them, just, this vague admonishment from my editor that you might be doing something really, really stupid.
Yeah.
And you're not going to know. In my head, all these threads came together. I knew that I could see it working. And I just kept going forward, trusting that it would work, because any given little part of it didn't make any sense. My mother just kept getting annoyed. He said, why do you keep asking Al about his childhood? Why aren't you asking him about social determinants of health and prison reform? But I had to ask Al about his childhood for reasons that are obvious once you read the book. But yeah,
you're telling a real story.
It's
not a treatise.
It was a story, and I found it was a universal story. Have you ever heard the James Joyce line, "In the particulars can be found the universal"? And that's a guiding principle for anything long that I write. It's, all these small things add up into something universal, even if the details are not my details. The greater point is mine. It resonates with me.
It sounds like you, and I don't know if this is from experience or if it's something that is in you and has always been in you, but that you have a sort of sense of the scope of this project, that you trusted that you would be able to pull off all these bits and pieces fitting together in the end.
During the day I did, in the middle of the night, not so much.
Yeah, doubt for sure. But on some level, I mean, for me, that's why I write novels and not short stories. I feel like I can hold that long thing in my head, even if I don't know what it is. And it sounded just like you were sort of saying, on some level, you just trust your own process.
Yeah, I think every writer, again, not to get sort of too self-absorbed, but...
Well, we are here to
talk about writers.
We are here to talk about your book.
You have an ideal length, right? There are people who are simply better at short stories or at essays or at... I do long. I cut 70,000 words out of a book. I do really long, but I see bigger stories, and I always have. And so this is the biggest. This is certainly the most ambitious thing I have ever written.
One question I get a lot is, how do you know when to stop researching and to start writing? And also, how does it work? Do you do some research and then you just plunge in and continue to research, or do you kind of do it all up front?
I've never understood people who do the research and then write.
Yeah.
Because the writing leads to questions.
Yes.
Right. I can't describe, the car chase unless I know what color the car was, and my research hasn't told me what color the car was. So now I need to go back and find out what color the car was.
Yeah.
So it starts with a huge chunk of research. And then when I feel like I'm ready to put it down on paper like an outline, just the way the story is going to go in large chunks, no details, I do. And then I fill it in with the research I have, and then I'll start writing it with that. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot more research that goes into, sometimes on the sentence level. There's a line in the story I was talking about, motorcycle racing, another area I did not think I was going to spend months of my life researching, but it was fascinating and it was directly relevant to everything that happened next. And so there was a line that said, motorcycle racing was the single, actually it was a couple of lines, the single most popular spectator sport in America in 1908, which is what I was writing about, which I did not know, and it was one of these facts, like, how did I not know that? Did you know that? No. Motorcycle racing was the single most popular spectator sport in America. It was bigger than, professional football or professional baseball, and then I had to look. I had to go back and make sure there was professional football and professional baseball, right? I'm writing a fact-based book. This is a simple sentence, but it could be completely wrong. And there's a reader out there who will know and will write to me about it. So I researched the history of professional football and the history of professional baseball. I played around with a way of, maybe I would say Babe Ruth hadn't been born yet, but technically he had, but he wasn't playing baseball yet. So that didn't fit in the sentence. And then the sentence ended that, and the writers were the movie stars of their day. And there were glossy magazines, there were people following their every, their romances. And then I said, movie stars. When were there movies? Right? 1908, were there movie stars? The history of movie stars is fascinating. In 1908, there were no movie stars. There were movies, but they were not credited. So none of the actors were named. You did not know who you were watching. And the first movie star was arguably a woman whose name I now forget, who basically picked up and walked across the street for more money to another studio, and breaking her contract and the subsequent fight made headlines, and that was the first actor whose name was known to the general public. That was about 1912. They made me cut that, so I don't remember it exactly. I did tuck some of it in the endnotes. If you do get this book, read the endnotes. I love my endnotes. I got to tuck in so many of the things they made me cut. And so the endnotes are kind of like my conversation with the reader to say, if you've gotten this far, I love you. And here is my gift to you for getting this far. So yeah, but that's what the
endnotes are really great.
That's what the whole writing was like. Was I wrote this sentence, and now can it possibly be true?
Can I ask one more question and then we'll move on? Okay. We did promise.
I talk long too.
No, it's perfect. We did promise that we would talk about Leopold and Loeb, and I wanted to ask you about that. But let's first, for anyone who might not know, explain who that is.
Okay, but first I do this sort of poll of the audience. Who does recognize the names Leopold and Loeb?
Not everybody.
No, not everybody, and it's consistent with what I've been finding. A lot of it is age, right? Most audiences, anyone sort of 50 and older will raise their hands. If I then say the two University of Chicago students who thought they were so brilliant that they could get away with murder, does that ring any more bells? And usually a few more hands go up. But Gen X and Gen Z have no idea. They were the first, they were one of the first murder of the century, trial of the century, which is a term that if you Google it, oh my God, they can't all be. But they were two University of Chicago students who thought they could get away with murder, and spoiler alert, they were not brilliant enough to get away with murder because they were caught fairly soon after because of their own stupidity. Had a hugely sensationalized trial. Clarence Darrow represented them. It was part of Clarence Darrow's crusade against the death penalty, and his goal there was to keep them from hanging.
He was kind of the first celebrity.
Yes, he was. Yeah. And they'd admitted everything. There was no getting them off. He wanted to keep them from hanging, and he did. And they were sentenced to 99 years to life. And I read Leopold's biography. Leopold wrote his autobiography when he was in prison for 99 years to life. Loeb died young. So he never really got his say. We never really got his story. We got Loeb's. Oh, we got Leopold's. He wrote his autobiography, and I was reading it because they were in the prison where Al met Joe. So I was reading it to find out what was life like in that prison. And all of a sudden, I get to this chapter where Leopold is describing how, basically because he and Loeb were bored, they started taking bets on which of their fellow prisoners, when released on parole, and parole was pretty new then, when released on parole, which would stay out, which would do good, and which would come back. And they found they were right, a good percentage of the time. They had a long time to watch. They had 99 years to life. And so they started keeping statistics at a time when sociology was also very new, and statistics were, and statistical analysis was very new. And so they started keeping the numbers, and then they tried to codify their hunches. Why do we know that that person will do okay and that one won't? And eventually they worked all of this with the help of professors at the University of Chicago and publishing under false names. They created a theory of parole prediction and how to predict whether someone would do good or not. And you can learn a whole lot more in the book. I won't take up more time. But the instrument that they created was what Joseph DeSalvo filled out when he was looking for parole, and the prediction that he would do well was what persuaded Al to support his parole and probably got him parole. So again, if Bobby Franks had not been killed by 2 University of Chicago students in 1924, then David Troy arguably might not have died in 1960. So yeah. They stood up and said, "Hi, where are your book 2?" So,
Wonderful.
Wow. I just love this. What a raconteur. And for all of you who are interested in Leopold and Loeb, there's a novel by Mayer Levin, which was very famous back in the day. And there's still 2 copies in the system. I just checked. I am a librarian. And it's called Compulsion. So if you ever decide you want to learn more about Leopold and Loeb, there is this novel that you could borrow
that's
from
the very
library.
sexualized version, is the novel by Mayer Levin. There are also 3 nonfiction books. It's all in the endnotes.
The endnotes.
And it's what most of the 70,000 words that were cut were the actual crime. Because my thinking was, there are all these books. They're wonderful. If I learned it in someone else's book, I can cut it from mine. I'm going to keep what I didn't learn from someone else's book. So because of those books, which are fabulous and fascinating, that made mine easier to trim down.
Okay, so now is the time when you get to ask your questions.
You almost just answered my question, but I've been spending the last 20 minutes trying to frame it. The 70,000 words caught my ear. And I wanted to say that we have a writer in my writing group who's written a young adult novel. It's very good. And his story was that he worked with his agent who convinced him to cut out 110,000 words. And I can't conceive, and nobody in our group can conceive, how he did that, under what duress or argument, whatever. So when you said that you cut 70,000 words out, I guess I wanted to ask you, can you explain to writers or non-writers what that means? And I hate to use the term killing your babies, but...
Blood on the floor. It means blood on the floor.
If you would.
They were not wrong, okay? Both my editor and my agent came to that conclusion. They were not wrong, but it was ugly. My agent was not polite about it, and he's no longer my agent. My editor was extremely kind about it, and we're talking about a next book together. So it's emotional. It is. This is what we do, and a lot of a writer's identity is in those words, and it was not the best time of my life. Where I landed was I had to write this in order to see what this was. You know, bonsai tree, marble statue,
all of it.
whatever the metaphor you choose, you had to have all of it. I also realized when faced with cutting it, so what was I so attached to? Why did I feel like all of this had to be in there? And I realized it's because I was doing it for the families. Each family experienced my writing in a different way. Al's, it was very much an all of us getting to know each other thing. The DeSalvos were extremely hesitant to have me do this, even though none of them, the ones alive, remember ever meeting this man, the idea that they were related to a murderer. But mostly it was the Troys. David Troy's children were 3 months, 3 years, and 4 years old when he died. They were so new a family of 5 that there wasn't a photo of all of them together. And the newspaper ran a picture of the parents and the 2 daughters, and then an infant picture next to it of the baby. So all they had were stories. Again, we're coming back to all we are stories. And from a mother who they were hesitant to ask questions of because she clearly found it upsetting to answer them. So they didn't have nearly as much of their own family story as they wanted. So they experienced all of my research as getting their father back. There were some difficult realizations about their family in this story. Their father's mother was not a nice human being and was very unkind to their mother after their father's death. And they had to absorb some really horrifying stories. But they wanted them. They wanted all of it. And so I came to see the big story as kind of the director's cut. And I gave it to them. They read the longer version. And then once they had it, once they had everything that I had, here is everything that I know, then I could look at it as a book for people who were not David Troy's children. And I came up, I hired someone, because I hired a freelance editor, which I've never done before. There were a lot of them because publishing has changed, and there are a lot of really good editors who are no longer employed, and I hired a brilliant, wonderful man. I called him my hand-holding editor. And I kept saying, Peter, is it still going to be a big book? And I didn't mean a big book like, big blockbuster. I meant it has to be about the accretion of detail. It has to be about all the things that had to happen before this thing could happen. And I didn't want to take out too many of the things, because then the impact wasn't there, but I had to take out things because there were just too many. So we went chapter by chapter, and he made suggestions, and the North Star was 2 things. It had to stay if it directly connected this moment to the crime. If I could draw a straight line without feeling like I was contorting myself or the facts, then it stayed. And it didn't stay if I didn't find it, right? If it was the whole history of the Leopold and Loeb murder because I read several books about it and condensed them. If it was the history of July 4th, which is fascinating, and I can tuck some of it into the endnotes, but because so many of these events happened by coincidence on July 4th weekend, but that wasn't directly related to what happened, so it went out. So that's how I cut it, was 1 page at a time with those 2 criteria, and a very good editor who also was very kind to me.
I was wondering right from the very beginning that you were involved with this so much for 9 years. When you finally put this book to bed, how do you let it go? And how long did it take?
I really miss these guys. I mean, I lived with them for a long time. It's a very bizarre feeling. I miss them. I'm also really proud of the book as a book. And so I I don't have the feeling that I want to rewrite it, I want to learn more, I didn't get to say what I wanted to say, so that helped a lot. But it really was like living with these folks in my head. I imagine it's very similar to fiction, that these people are just with you, and then suddenly you have to say goodbye. It was the most profound version of that I've had of any book, I think, because it was the longest, and also because it's the only thing of this length I've written that I was involved in some way with the people in it. I mean, I don't want to make too much of that involvement. At one point, someone said, why don't you write it in first person? I'm like, because the only person in the entire book that I actually met, I met in my 50s. This isn't my story, it's just a story that I personally care about. But I cared about them a lot, and yeah, I hope I did well by them. I guess that's how I experienced it, is, guys, I hope I did well by you.
Hi, my name is Derek. I'm from Queens, New York. I really appreciate you sharing, getting details versus fiction in a novel. I'm a writer, and I'm an aspiring writer. I haven't been successful, but my piece is basically more of a manuscript screenplay about 1921 Tulsa riots in Oklahoma, and I based my piece on 3 characters who managed to survive it. So you really helped me as far as, and I'm glad you mentioned about the editing too, because I'm writing and I'm editing, and I'm getting on my own damn nerves. And she's read my work, and I've been turned down. Nobody turned me down and told me I had a lousy piece, but people haven't read it. So that's where the frustration comes. But I think maybe I should, instead of keeping it on, just after listening to you, I think maybe it might be an idea to turn this into a novel.
Well, for that you want her. No, seriously, they are very different.
Thank you.
They are very different talents, and I do not understand how people do what you do, because I can't. I'm very good, I think, at seeing something that really happened and finding a way to describe it and express it and put it in context and make it interesting. But I am woefully bad at making things up. I mean, when people accuse the press of making things up, I'm like, no, you don't understand. I have really bad fiction in a drawer. I am not good at making it up. So, my advice is try it, because you don't know necessarily what you're best at or what the best version of something is until you try it, and then you learn what you are a natural at and what you're not.
It helps to know your skills.
It helps to know your skills, but you don't know your skills until you've tried.
Right.
Until you've tried.
Yeah.
And I have tried fiction, and I will not again.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
So when I finished the book, I also missed the characters very much. But I wanted to ask you about Dante, who is, I guess, the brother-in-law of the slain police officer. So you contrast Dante, who had a similar trajectory to DeSalvo, but made it. So, so can you comment on that?
Yeah.
Give a little context.
So Dante Cosentino is also one of 10 children. Many families in here with 10 children. There is a family tree that I recommend you use, because it is a complicated book. And Dante is a member of the Cosentino family, and you've noticed you haven't heard that name, right? There's the DeSalvos, the Troys, and Al Tarlov. Dante, the Cosentinos had their own fraught existence, and Dante's sister married David Troy. So the Cosentinos were the in-laws. And Dante Cosentino, you got me. Dante Cosentino solved a problem for me. I had a book where for a long time, I didn't like the moral of my own story. Because here's Joseph DeSalvo, who has great raw material, right? But also a god-awful youth and a father who was not capable of being a parent. And you could argue there was nothing that could have helped him. There was nothing that could have prevented this, that he was doomed from the start. He was a loser, he was a ne'er-do-well, which was, actually a term of psychology at the time. And I didn't want to write a book about how here's this guy, and he was a jerk, and he did jerky things, and then he fooled my stepfather, and then he went and killed a cop. I was not in it for that. And then I met Dante. Dante had a horrific childhood. He was also brilliant, but uninterested in using any of his skills to better himself. He had a father who was also a drunk and who also abused him and his family physically and psychologically. And he also dropped out of school and he went AWOL from the army, and he did all of the things that Joe DeSalvo did. And then, and Dante, I just went to his 100th birthday party a few weeks ago. Dante is now he is no longer working as one, became a professor of philosophy in California. Dante pulled himself up. Dante got himself out. And I had my 3 men, right? And the Jewish kid became a doctor, and the Irish kid became a cop, and the Italian kid became a killer, and I didn't want to write that book either. But then there was Dante. And Dante said that the stereotypes are crap, or coincidence, or self-fulfilling prophecy, but they are not hard and true. And Dante said that yes, you can have a horrible existence and find a way out. And Dante sat in a class, in a psychology class, when he got himself into college because of the GI Bill. So Dante also said that, global events, macro events, have micro effects. And he sat in this psychology class, and his professor said that what is the difference between a boy who makes it and a boy who doesn't? It's someone who cares about him along the way and in time. And that realization Dante took to heart about himself. And so it became a moment in the book that said, wait a second, people, there's an okay moral here, one I agree with. And so, yeah, if I had to find a hero in the story, it was Dante. And the people who helped him along the way. Al tried to be that person for Joe DeSalvo. Wow. It was too late. It was too late, and the system conspired against it, and there were all sorts of reasons why it didn't work. But that's what Al was trying to do, was to be for Joe what a number of people who were described in the story were for Dante. So yeah, I love Dante. And he is as wonderful a human being at 100 as he is jumping off the pages as a child.
Wow. I love it that this is a minor character.
First of all, I must thank you both. I love the process of what you go through. The fact that you had characters that are going, over here, don't finish your research yet, whatever. And I am simply a reader, a ferocious reader, and I can't wait. I have not read this yet. I cannot wait. But my question to you is, while you have these characters, while you're going on this, is the next book in your mind? Is somewhere along the way you go, okay, you're on your own train track, and you're not going to run into anything, but now you're going to go sideways? What's next, or how do you know what's next? As much as I love thinking of reading this.
It's a good last question. It is a good last question. The answer is sometimes, so it was, I finished my first book and immediately started on the second, and I knew what it was going to be about while I was working on the first. That second one came out in 1999, and this one came out in 2023. So no, I didn't know, writing my second major book, what my next book was going to be. This one just landed in my lap. But in doing all of this digging down rabbit holes for this book, I came across another story that I said, oh, I have to write this. And I've been noodling on that in various iterations since. If I do it, I have not yet, written the proposal or gotten the contract. It's been marinating for a while. If I do it, it's also a work of history. I became very enamored of writing history, writing this book. And, if I had to do it again, might even have majored in history, gotten an advanced degree in history. I really, the whole process was just revelatory for me, because you can come to conclusions a lot of years later that you can't come to when you're in the middle of it. And all of my training has been journalistic, and my first 2 books were immersion books. I watched something happen and I wrote about it while it happened. And given the times, journalism is overwhelming and exhausting right now. I give huge credit to the people who still have the energy to get out there every day and fight. But I feel somewhat emeritus now as I'm getting older, and much more in a mental space where I want to sit back and evaluate what happened in the richness of time, I think is and so, yeah, so I'm going back into the past, and people are standing up and talking to me again. And maybe I should be taking medication for that, but I'm going to write another book.
Yay.
Yay.
And she does what I do, only she gets to make it up. Which
Not all of it.
So I want to thank both of you for coming here and sharing your time and your stories with us. And as Lisa so eloquently put it, we are our stories. That will stay with me. And I want to thank all of you for coming out and making this a program. And this is the moment when I remind everybody that although we at the library are all about giving it away, if you really admire an author, if you want there to be more books like their books, if you want them to be able to keep writing, then you'll consider purchasing a copy of their book. And there is no greater compliment to an author than to own a copy of their book, to want to own a copy of their book. And so we're going to file out in just a minute where Margot from Watch Young Booksellers is ready, and both Christina and Lisa will be signing copies of their books. I also wanted to let you know that we do have our next Open Book, Open Mind program lined up for January 24th, which is a Wednesday. It's the feminist philosopher Kate Mann from Cornell has written a book called Unshrinking, Facing Fat Phobia. And she's going to be talking with our own Kate Tuttle, the book critic and current co-chair of Open Book, Open Mind. So thanks for coming. Buy a book, come back. Your library needs you and loves you.